No one in the village of Kromholm dared enter the forest in the heart of winter. The snow fell thick and silent, burying the paths that led into the dark woods. At night, when the moonlight reflected off the untouched snowdrifts, the forest looked almost beautiful, like a sleeping giant. But the villagers knew better. Because when winter came, so did he. The stories spoke of a figure cloaked in white, appearing just beyond the tree line, always surrounded by wolves. They called him the Winter Shepherd, and his arrival was a harbinger of loss. He was no ordinary man, they said. He was older than the village itself, older than the trees that clawed at the sky. The Winter Shepherd would watch from the forest's edge, and when he left, someone would disappear. A child, a wanderer, a soul unfortunate enough to stray too far. For as long as anyone could remember, this was the way of things. The snowstorm arrived earlier that year. By December 15th, the village was buried under 3 feet of snow, and the winds howled like restless spirits. For Emma and her younger brother Jakob, it meant no school, no chores, and all the time in the world to play. "We're going to the woods," Jakob announced one morning as he pulled on his heavy coat. Emma froze by the fire. "No, we're not," she said sharply. "You know what they say about the forest." Jakob rolled his eyes. "It's just a story to scare kids like us. Papa says the Winter Shepherd is a legend." "He's real," Emma insisted. "Mrs. Hawke lost her son 2 winters ago. He went to the forest, and he never came back." Jakob shrugged, his cheeks red from the fire's warmth. "He probably fell through the ice or something. I'm not scared of stories." Emma felt the pit in her stomach grow heavier. "Papa will be angry if we go near the woods." Jakob grinned, that mischievous light in his eyes shining brighter. "Then don't tell him." That afternoon, while their father was away clearing snow from the church roof, Emma found herself standing at the edge of the woods, staring into the shadows that lay beyond the snow-covered pines. "Jakob, come back!" she called. Her voice disappeared into the trees. Her little brother had run ahead, his footprints vanishing quickly as the wind blew flurries of snow across the ground. Emma hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to stay behind. But Jakob was only 10, and she couldn't leave him out here alone. "Jakob!" she shouted again, louder this time. There was no answer. With a deep breath, Emma stepped into the forest. The change was immediate. The sound of the wind was muffled, swallowed by the dense trees. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the branches, falling in perfect silence. Emma could feel the weight of the forest pressing in around her, the shadows darker and deeper than they had any right to be. Jakob's footprints led her forward, winding deeper into the woods. She followed them for what felt like hours, the cold seeping into her bones. Then she saw him. Jakob stood in a small clearing, perfectly still, staring at something just beyond the trees. Emma's heart leapt in relief. "Jakob, what are you doing?" Her brother didn't respond. He didn't even turn around. Emma's relief turned to confusion, and then to dread. Slowly, she followed his gaze. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, half obscured by the trees. He was tall and thin, his body wrapped in a heavy white cloak that blended perfectly with the snow. His face was hidden beneath a hood, and his hands, gloved and motionless, rested at his sides. Around him, wolves sat in a perfect circle, their eyes fixed on Jakob. Their fur was white as the snow, and they didn't move, didn't growl, didn't blink. The winter shepherd. Emma's blood ran cold. She grabbed Jakob's arm, pulling him backward. "Jakob, come on," she whispered, panic rising in her throat. But Jakob didn't move. His eyes were wide, glassy, as though he were in a trance. "Come," the figure said. His voice was deep and hollow, like the sound of the wind through an empty room. Emma felt her knees weaken. "No!" she managed to choke out. "Leave us alone!" The winter shepherd tilted his head almost curiously. "The balance must be kept." He raised one gloved hand and pointed at Jakob. Emma yanked her brother's arm harder. "Jakob, please!" Finally, Jakob blinked. His body jerked slightly, as though he were waking from a dream, and Emma pulled him with all her strength. The wolves stood now, their movements slow and deliberate, their eyes gleaming like ice. "Run!" Emma screamed. She didn't remember how they got out of the forest. The next thing Emma knew, they were stumbling back into the village, breathless and shaking. Snow clung to their clothes, and their boots were soaked through. Behind them, the woods were still and quiet, as though nothing had happened. But Emma knew better. She had seen him, and so had Jakob. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. The image of the winter shepherd standing in the clearing haunted her, his voice echoing in her ears. The balance must be kept. What had he meant? What balance? She sat up in bed, staring at the window. The snowstorm had returned, the wind rattling against the glass. But through the swirling snow, Emma saw something that made her heart stop. A figure stood just beyond the edge of the forest, tall and unmoving. His white cloak billowed in the wind, and beside him, the wolves sat in perfect stillness. He was watching their house. Emma pulled the curtains shut, her hands trembling. The winter shepherd wasn't finished with them yet. Emma sat on her bed, clutching her knees to her chest as the storm raged outside. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of the snow-covered landscape outside the window. The curtains stayed shut, but she could still feel him out there, watching. Beside her, Jakob slept fitfully, mumbling something she couldn't make out. She watched him closely, the pale moonlight casting shadows across his face. He looked peaceful now, but his expression was strange, almost vacant. Her mind replayed the encounter in the woods over and over, the winter shepherd's silent command, the wolves, the trance that had taken Jakob. She had pulled him out, but had she really saved him? A loud thump startled her, echoing from outside. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she rose and padded across the room, her bare feet numb against the cold wooden floor. She moved the curtain just enough to peek through. For a moment, there was nothing, just the snow swirling in the dim light. But then she saw it. Footprints. They stretched across the snow, leading up to the house and stopping just beneath the window. There was no one there now, but the prints were unmistakably fresh. And then she noticed something else. Another set of footprints, smaller, breaking off toward the woods. Emma turned sharply to look at Jakob. His bed was empty. Her chest seized with panic. "Jakob," she whispered, her voice trembling. She searched the dark corners of the room, as if her brother might somehow still be there. Then she heard it, the faint, rhythmic sound of bells. It wasn't coming from inside the house. It was drifting in from the woods. "No," Emma whispered, shoving her feet into boots and grabbing her coat. She bolted downstairs, barely stopping to grab the lantern by the door. The wind hit her like a wall as she stepped outside, the cold biting through her coat and into her bones. The snow fell thick and fast, and the footprints leading to the forest were already half covered. "Jakob!" Emma shouted into the howling wind, but there was no reply, only the distant chiming of bells. She hesitated at the tree line, the forest looming ahead like a dark and endless void. The stories came flooding back to her, of children lost forever, of wolves that hunted without sound, of the winter shepherd's endless vigil. But Jakob was her brother. She couldn't let him go. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the woods. The forest was a different world at night. The snow muffled every sound except for the bells, which grew louder with every step Emma took. The trees closed in around her, their branches twisted and heavy with snow. The lantern's light bounced and flickered, barely cutting through the darkness. She followed the footprints, her breath fogging the air in front of her. "Jakob!" she called again, her voice breaking. The bells chimed in answer, clearer now. They sounded closer, too close. As she moved deeper into the forest, the temperature seemed to plummet. The air itself felt heavy, pressing against her chest. Her vision blurred, and the light from the lantern grew dimmer, as though the very darkness was swallowing it whole. Then in the distance, she saw him. Jakob stood at the center of a clearing, staring up at a massive, gnarled tree. The roots burst from the ground like claws, and its branches stretched impossibly high, each one draped with bells of different shapes and sizes. They swayed gently, though there was no wind. And standing on the other side of the clearing, watching Jakob, was the winter shepherd. Emma's throat went dry. The shepherd was exactly as she remembered, tall and unmoving, his white cloak blending with the snow. The wolves were with him, their pale forms almost invisible against the drifts. They sat in a perfect circle around the clearing, their eyes reflecting the faint light of the lantern. "Jakob!" Emma shouted, stumbling into the clearing. "Jakob, come here!" Her brother didn't move. It was as if he couldn't hear her. The shepherd raised his head slowly, as though noticing her for the first time. "You should not have come," he said, his voice deep and echoing, as if carried on the wind. Emma took a step closer, ignoring the fear clawing at her chest. "Let him go." The winter shepherd tilted his head. "He is chosen." "No," Emma said firmly. "You can't have him." The shepherd raised his arm, and the bells on the tree began to ring, their chimes soft but unnervingly clear. Jakob's head tilted upward, as though listening. His feet began to move, slowly, deliberately, toward the shepherd. "Stop!" Emma screamed, rushing forward and grabbing Jakob's arm. His skin was ice cold and his expression was blank, his eyes unfocused. "Do not interfere," the shepherd said, his tone darker now, sharper. "The balance must be kept." "What balance?" Emma cried, holding her brother tightly. "The balance between life and death," the shepherd replied. "He is claimed, and you cannot undo what has been set in motion." Emma's mind raced. The shepherd spoke of balance, of something old and inevitable, but she refused to accept it. "Take me instead," she blurted out before she could stop herself. The shepherd's hollow gaze turned to her. The wolves stirred slightly, their heads tilting in unison. "You offer yourself?" "Yes," Emma said quickly, her voice shaking. "Just let him go." The shepherd was silent for a long moment, the bells ringing, growing softer, almost contemplative. "A life for a life," he said finally. "The balance will be kept." Emma turned to Jakob, cupping his face in her hands. "Go home, Jakob. Run and don't look back, no matter what you hear. Do you understand me?" Jakob blinked, as though waking from a dream. "Emma!" "Go!" she shouted, pushing him toward the path. Jakob hesitated, his eyes wide with fear, but then he turned and ran, his small figure disappearing into the darkness. The bells began to toll louder now, their sound vibrating through the clearing. The shepherd stepped forward, his wolves rising to their feet, their eyes fixed on Emma. She felt the cold seep deeper into her body, as though it were burrowing into her very bones. Her limbs felt heavy, her breath shallow. "You understand what you have done," the shepherd said. "Yes," Emma whispered. "You will take my place," he said. "As I once took the place of another. You will be the watcher, the keeper of the balance." Emma felt her knees buckle, her vision dimming as the bell's sound consumed her. She looked up one last time at the winter shepherd, who now seemed to be fading, his form becoming one with the snow and wind. The wolves moved closer, their eyes glowing faintly as the world around her went dark. When Emma opened her eyes, she was standing at the edge of the forest, wrapped in a white cloak that billowed around her like mist. The wolves sat silently at her feet, waiting. She turned toward the village, her hollow gaze falling on the faint lights of home in the distance. Behind her, the bells rang softly, carried on the winter wind. The winter shepherd had gone, and she had taken his place. The world had changed, or perhaps Emma had. She stood at the forest's edge, staring back at the village of Kromholm. The familiar rooftops and curling smoke from chimneys looked different now, distant, hazy, like a memory she couldn't quite reach. The white cloak hung heavy on her shoulders, blending her into the snow as though she were part of it. The wolves sat silently at her feet, their pale eyes fixed on the village with an unnatural calm. Emma felt no cold, no hunger, no exhaustion. Instead, there was a heaviness deep within her chest, a weight she couldn't shake. She was the winter shepherd now, the watcher, the keeper, and though she knew she had saved Jakob, she could still hear the bells. Always the bells. Emma turned and looked back into the forest, its towering trees stretching endlessly into the distance. She could feel it now, the pulse of the woods, ancient and alive, pressing against her thoughts. It was more than a place, it was a presence. She felt its hunger, its demand for balance. Her wolves shifted at her feet, and without a word, they moved, their paws leaving no trace in the snow. Emma followed, as though her body knew the path, even if her mind did not. The forest guided her deeper, until she reached the clearing where the massive tree stood. The bells were silent now, but they hung from its twisted branches, swaying gently as though in some unseen breeze. A voice whispered through the clearing, low and distant. "You have taken the mantle." Emma turned sharply. Across the clearing stood a shadowed figure cloaked in white, the former shepherd. His presence seemed dimmer now, like smoke caught in the light. "I saved my brother," Emma said, her voice steady but hollow. "And now you will save others," the figure replied. "Or claim them?" Emma's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" The shepherd tilted his head, his hollow eyes gleaming faintly beneath the hood. "The balance must be kept. Each winter, the forest takes what it is owed. It will call you to guide the lost, to claim the chosen." Emma felt her stomach twist. "I won't hurt anyone." "You will not have a choice," the shepherd replied, his voice like the creaking of ancient trees. "When they stray too far, when they forget the pact, you will find them, and you will decide their fate." "I can't," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "You must," the shepherd said, fading like mist into the air. "The forest demands it." Days passed, or maybe weeks. Time was strange now, fluid and meaningless. Emma wandered the forest, her wolves, silent guardians at her side. She felt the pull of the forest's will, its whispers guiding her to those who had strayed too close. The first was a hunter. Emma found him wandering the snowy woods, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He was muttering to himself, his face pale and hollow-eyed. He had lost his way, but the forest had guided him deeper, twisting the paths until he couldn't escape. When Emma appeared, stepping from the shadows like a phantom, the man fell to his knees. "Please," he choked out, his breath fogging the air. "I didn't mean to." She felt the weight of the forest pressing down on her, demanding balance. She could see his life, his choices, stretched before her like an open book. He had killed more than he needed, taken from the land without care or respect. The forest was owed its price. "You knew the rules," Emma said softly, though the words didn't feel like her own. The man wept, his cries swallowed by the snow. The wolves circled him, their eyes glowing faintly, waiting for Emma's command. She raised her hand, and the man fell silent. The wolves moved as one, their forms dissolving into shadow as they closed in. When the snow settled, there was nothing left but silence. The balance had been restored. Emma returned to the edge of the village that night. She watched from the shadows as light poured from the windows of her home, her father's silhouette moving across the curtains. Jakob was there too, laughing softly as he played by the fire. Emma wanted to step forward, to run to them and tell them she was safe. But she couldn't. The forest wouldn't let her. She turned back toward the trees, her heart aching in a way she couldn't describe. This was her life now. She was the shepherd. The days grew darker and the snow piled higher. The villagers whispered of strange things in the woods, of wolves that moved without sound, of figures glimpsed in the trees watching. They spoke of the bells that sometimes rang in the dead of night, when the air was still and cold. Some called it superstition. Others knew better. Jakob didn't forget. He sat by the window each night, staring out into the snow as though waiting for someone to return. The forest loomed beyond the village, dark and endless, and sometimes, if he listened closely, he thought he could hear the faint sound of bells. It was the eve of Christmas when the storm arrived. The wind howled through the village, rattling shutters and burying roads in feet of snow. Jakob sat up in bed, unable to sleep. Something about the storm felt wrong, too loud, too angry. Then he heard it, a single bell chiming softly through the wind. Jakob's heart leapt into his throat. He scrambled to his feet, throwing on his coat as he crept downstairs. The house was dark and silent, his father asleep in the next room. Jakob opened the front door, and the wind nearly knocked him back. Snow swirled in thick waves, but through it he saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest. She was cloaked in white, her face hidden beneath a hood. Wolves sat at her feet, their pale eyes glowing in the dark. Jakob knew who she was. "Emma," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. The figure didn't move. Jakob stepped into the snow, his small boots sinking deep with each step. "Emma, is that you?" The figure raised her head, and for a moment, the wind seemed to die. Jakob saw her face, pale, still, her eyes distant and sad. "Go home, Jakob," Emma said softly, her voice carried on the wind. "I came to find you," Jakob said, tears welling in his eyes. "You can't," Emma replied. "I can't come back." Jakob took another step forward, the cold biting at his skin. "Please," he begged. "Come home." Emma's wolves stirred, their forms shifting like mist, but she raised a hand to stop them. She stepped closer to her brother, her face full of sorrow. "I will always watch over you," she said. "But you have to go back. It's not your time." Jakob's lip quivered. "Will I see you again?" Emma's expression faltered, just for a moment. "Maybe," she whispered. "Someday." And then, like snow on the wind, she was gone. When Jakob woke the next morning, he was back in his bed, his coat and boots damp from the snow. The storm had passed, and the forest was silent. His father found him staring out the window again, his face pale but calm. "She's out there," Jakob said softly. His father didn't respond. He simply pulled Jakob close and stared out into the woods, where the snow fell gently over the trees. And in the distance, though faint and far away, the sound of bells began to toll. The forest was silent as Emma stood beneath the ancient tree, its gnarled branches heavy with bells that hung like frozen tears. The wolves were still at her side, watching her with unblinking pale eyes. They had become her shadow, her silent guardians. Her thoughts were no longer her own. The forest whispered to her constantly now, soft, indistinct voices murmuring about the balance, the cycles, the names of those who would wander too far. The forest remembers, the forest takes. She had become its voice, its hands. But her heart ached for the life she'd lost, for the brother she could never return to. And in that grief, a small part of Emma, fragile, human, wondered if there was still a way to end it all, to break the cycle. That Christmas day, the forest called out to her. A presence had entered the woods, one that Emma recognized instantly. Jakob. The boy had wandered into the trees, clutching a lantern against the growing storm. He looked so small against the vast, snow-covered pines, his footprints trailing behind him like fragile marks on a blank canvas. Emma's heart clenched. "No, Jakob. Not here." The wolves began to move, gliding silently ahead of her through the snow. Emma followed, her white cloak flowing behind her as though it were part of the wind itself. She knew the forest's will. It wanted Jakob. The balance demanded him. But she would not let that happen. She found him in a clearing, kneeling in the snow. The lantern lay beside him, its flame flickering weakly against the icy wind. Jakob's shoulders shook, his face buried in his hands. "Jakob," Emma said softly, stepping toward him. His head shot up, and his eyes widened. "Emma!" he shouted, his voice raw with relief and desperation. Emma stopped. She could feel the forest pressing in around her, its whispers growing louder, hungrier. The wolves circled the edge of the clearing, their pale eyes fixed on the boy. "You shouldn't have come here," Emma said, her voice heavy with sadness. "I had to," Jakob choked out, his breath misting in the cold air. "I had to find you. You're my sister." Emma shook her head, tears freezing on her cheeks. "I can't come back, Jakob. I'm part of this now. The forest, it won't let me leave." "I don't care," Jakob cried. "I'll stay here with you. You don't have to be alone." The wolves moved closer, their bodies blending with the snow like shadows. Emma could feel the forest's anger rising, its demand for balance growing sharper. "Run, Jakob," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You have to go back, before it's too late." "No," Jakob shouted, standing up. "I won't leave you." The air turned icy, the wind howling through the trees as the bells began to toll again, low, deep notes that shook the ground beneath them. Emma's wolves bared their teeth, their bodies tensing. The forest had made its choice. Jakob stumbled back as the wolves began to advance, their movements slow and deliberate, like predators closing in on prey. Emma stepped between them, raising her arms to hold them back. "Stop!" she shouted. The wolves froze, their heads turning toward her in unison. Emma could feel the forest's fury, its whispers rising to a deafening roar. He must be taken, the balance must be kept. "No," Emma said firmly, turning her gaze to the dark canopy above. "You can't have him. I won't let you take him." The forest trembled, the trees groaning as the ground beneath her cracked like ice. The wolves howled, their cries echoing through the clearing. Emma fell to her knees, clutching her head as the bells tolled louder, their sound tearing through her like a knife. The ancient voice of the forest filled her mind. The price must be paid. Emma looked up at Jakob, who stood frozen with fear, his wide eyes locked on hers. She had made a promise that day in the village, one she couldn't break. If the forest wanted a life, it would take hers. She turned back to the wolves, to the tree, to the unseen force that demanded balance. "Take me," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. The forest seemed to hesitate. The wolves stopped, their pale eyes flickering with something unreadable. "I'm the shepherd now," Emma continued. "Let him go. Take me." The bells fell silent. The ground beneath the ancient tree cracked open, splitting wide like a jagged mouth. Darkness spilled from the earth, a cold void that pulled at Emma with invisible hands. She felt her body grow heavy, as though the very air were turning to stone. "Go, Jakob," she whispered, forcing herself to smile. "Go home." "Emma, no!" Jakob cried, trying to reach for her. But the wind pushed him back, carrying his voice away as the darkness swallowed her. The last thing Emma saw was her brother's tear-streaked face disappearing into the swirling snow as the forest closed around her. Then there was nothing. When Jakob woke, he was lying at the edge of the forest. The snowstorm had stopped, and the village lay quiet and peaceful under a pale winter sky. His father found him there, shivering and silent, staring back into the trees. "What happened, Jakob?" his father asked gently, pulling him close. Jakob didn't answer. He couldn't. The forest was quiet now, and the figure in white was gone. But deep in the woods, where the snow fell soft and undisturbed, the bells rang faintly, carried on the wind, a song only the lost could hear. Jakob listened for a moment, then turned back toward home. The following winter, the villagers of Kromholm noticed something strange. The forest was quieter than it had ever been. The wolves, once feared for their silent hunts, no longer came near the village. But when the snow fell thick and heavy and the nights grew long, children swore they saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods. She wore a white cloak, her face pale and calm, her wolves sitting at her feet. She never moved, never spoke. She simply watched. And sometimes, in the dead of night, the bells tolled faintly, as though reminding the village of the price that had been paid. The balance had been kept, and the winter shepherd watched over the forest still,